These and more stories, go to our website at telesurenglish.net.
Hello, I'm Jorge Gestoso. Welcome to a new program. On today's show, another U.S. presidential election in which the Democratic Party is trying to put aside Bernie Sanders to impose his own candidate, and how fair was the trial of the 4 defendants of the Embassy of Venezuela here in Washington, and what about his future? We ask our guest, Patricio Zamorano, political analyst and co-director of the Council on Hemispheric Affairs. Patricio Zamorano, a warm welcome to the program.
Thank you for inviting me.
Patricio, how you see the situation within the Democratic Party in terms of running for the nomination?
Well, I would say that they have a lot of tensions because, in fact, it's not only the fact that Bernie Sanders is maybe leading polls, especially at the national level. For the first time, he's the first one runner now. But the fact that Joe Biden is not the first one. Joe Biden needs good news as soon as possible. He didn't have any presence in the Iowa caucus. He really had a very, very bad outcome in New Hampshire. He ran away immediately to South Carolina the same day of the primaries just to try to build momentum. So I would say the Democratic Party is facing again a situation where very early on during the primary process, Bernie Sanders is growing extremely fast. They need Joe Biden to have a better outcome as soon as possible. So I would say the party is now wondering what's going to happen in the next months. He really needs a good story as soon as possible. Maybe during Super Tuesday, maybe it's going to be a better outcome for him.
On March 3rd. In the U.S., they have created the myth that socialism is a dirty word. And Bernie Sanders, he said that he is a Democrat socialist, which is basically, he said, democracy and socialism like in the Nordic countries like Finland, like Sweden, like Norway. But only 39% of Americans, according to polls, will be ready to vote for a socialist, quote unquote. He said that they'd rather even vote for a Muslim or a gay, but not for a socialist. And that, at that point, the Democratic National Committee is afraid, is scared to death. So we need to put someone that could beat Donald Trump, because even Donald Trump, as a strategy, is talking very nicely about Bernie Sanders, because he believes if Bernie will be the candidate, he will beat him precisely. Label him not as a socialist, but as a communist. Sure. That it's absolutely unthinkable for the U.S. And now there is this new phenomenon, which is Mike Bloomberg. Your reaction?
Sure. Well, I would say that Donald Trump can see the same polls that we have access to, and the polls are extremely clear that in a real competition, if the elections were this coming weekend, Joe Biden will be the next president of the United States. Joe Biden has the biggest advantage when you compare Joe Biden against Donald Trump. The rest of candidates, actually Warren, Sanders, etc., they also win over Donald Trump, but Joe Biden wins for 10 points. So he's desperate. Donald Trump is desperate, basically, to trying to avoid that Joe Biden is the next candidate that is going to compete against him. And we have this theory in political science where you can see clearly a pattern where when you go from one president to the other, the electorate is trying to look for the opposite style, especially when you have a character like Donald Trump that is very radical in his messages, is affecting the dignity of the presidential palace, the White House. So the theory says that maybe the best candidate to replace him is a moderate candidate as Joe Biden. In that sense, Bernie Sanders is too extreme for the electorate. And we have to remember that in terms of the ideology of the country, this is a conservative country, this is a center-right country. So I'm not sure if the country is prepared for Bernie Sanders in that sense.
There is this former mayor of New York that he has been mayor for about 12 years, which is Mike Bloomberg, the sixth richest person in the world with $60 billion fortune, that he says, Joe Biden is too weak. Bernie Sanders, too leftist. So I am the person who has limitless resources and can beat, because also I know him, Trump, the two of them from New York, I can beat him, and therefore I'm going to put as much money as is necessary. Already he's going to participate in a debate and already appears like second in the polls to beat Trump. Is he going to be finally the one who represents the party and not Biden? What do you think?
Well, who knows? Because so far, at least, we are very early into the primary process. But you can see Joe Biden, he's more worried, or he's spending a lot of energy and time explaining why he's not the first one. But in terms of his agenda, it's not clear. He was interviewed last weekend in several political programs on national TV, and he really couldn't explain himself in terms of what he offers for the country. Very weak, trying to defend himself still because of the case in Ukraine and the involvement of his son. So he's not really engaging young people, new voters. Bernie Sanders is doing a better job than him. Warren as well, Klobuchar, Buttigieg, all of them are really doing a better job than Joe Biden. Joe Biden it looks flat now, kind of like a shock that he's not first everywhere. He's not. For the first time, he's number 3 at the national level. Bloomberg is actually second, and Sanders first. So I think he is in the middle of a crisis. He really needs to do something, at least in South Carolina, and then on March the 3rd, where we have more than 400 delegates in California, we have more than 200 in Texas, more than 100 in North Carolina. He really needs a better story, good news, as soon as possible.
One question could be, who's first, the chicken or the egg? Given the fact that they're trying to put, as they did in 2016 with Hillary Clinton, Bernie Sanders on the side, because he's so socialist. What if what he's getting in every single rally, that even these few days, he's already in California talking about the people, and we're talking about 10, 15, 20,000 people with him, and he said, they're trying to stop me. Do you think that they can stop that people? Why not to admit that eventually a very important percentage of the Americans are absolutely involved with his agenda, and should be respected the option, and not to see him like the boogeyman, and therefore you have to, because they did it already. They put it aside in the past election.
Sure.
Is that a machine to keep the country to the center right? Sure. Or is that basically, given the fact that this is a capitalistic country with free market, will never come something different?
Sure. Bernie Sanders is an outsider. He doesn't belong to the establishment of the Democratic Party. We have to remember he's an independent senator for Vermont. He's not even a militant of the Democratic Party. So in that sense, he is fighting a whole machinery of that, and it's not the first time that actually happens. We have to remember when he was competing against Hillary Clinton, he was first for most of the campaign. Actually, the only reason that Hillary Clinton won is because of the figure of the superdelegates that actually ended up getting her the victory. But at the end of the day, Bernie Sanders was the most popular. Bernie Sanders is incredible. He's more than 70 years old, and he's extremely popular among millennials, younger generations that are inspired by the socialist agenda that he's trying to push, especially college debt, education issues, all the issues about the environment. He's very connected to those key issues that young people actually appreciate a lot. So that's why Joe Biden is the only one connected to these new voters. And if the Democratic Party is smart enough, they would support Bernie Sanders, because he's the candidate, being one of the oldest one, but he's also the candidate of the future.
And could happen that, for example, this is Donald Trump, that is going to be the candidate of the Republican Party, a billionaire, and then imagine that could end up being Mike Bloomberg, the candidate for the Democratic Party. We're talking two billionaires. And in the case of Trump, he was a Democrat to turn to be a Republican. In the case of Bloomberg, the opposite. He was a Republican. So is really among these two people ideologies, or they are just people who are going with the flow of the wind?
Well, we need to see, because Bloomberg is spending a lot of money. All of us who are actually using YouTube, we can see his ads in every single
Close
video.
to $400 million.
It's a lot of money. We can see commercials on TV, on radio. He's really spending a lot of money. So yeah, you are going to have a short-term effect in terms of the polls and in terms of the exposure. But I think it's actually too early. Bernie Sanders is not spending as much as Bloomberg, and he's first into the polls. So I don't know. I would say that the influence of the money is actually creates a lot of distortions. So we need to wait a little bit more.
Turning subjects. You've been following very closely, because you were there in the trial of the 4 protectors of the Embassy of Venezuela here in Washington. Even you wrote an article for the Council of Hemispheric Affairs that you co-direct. The name of the article is Mistrial: Trump's Government Fails to Convict the 4 Protectors of the Venezuelan Embassy. What happened here? I
mean, it's a shame that not a lot of media outlets actually reported on what happened last Friday, February 14, Valentine's Day, because of the fact that we had very important news that day, because even though the federal judge imposed a lot of restrictions to the defense in a way that they couldn't explain any of the political context of the presence of these 4 defenders at the Venezuelan embassy, the fact that we have the Vienna Convention that actually protects diplomatic missions, especially when the relationships are actually broken between 2 states. All that said, the judge was very intense on restricting a lot of information that you could share with the jury, and despite that, the jury didn't have enough conviction to actually to send these 4 people to jail. They said we are not gonna have an agreement here. We are deadlocked, so we cannot make a decision. So a mistrial was declared, and it's gonna be decided in a couple more weeks if the government, the prosecutors, insist in another trial, or actually the charges are dropped. So we are waiting for that. But big news for the international law. The judge basically didn't allow the jury to know about the international law that actually protected what these people were doing under the authorization of President Maduro's government.
So in that case, hearing what you're saying, the judge was not really fair, was not really balanced.
She was not, because she said first, okay, I want politics to be outside of the court, but then she allowed the government, the prosecutors, to share the political views of the government, saying, for example, that Guaidó was the legitimate president of Venezuela, that Carlos Vecchio was the ambassador, etc., etc. So the prosecutors were able to share this political view, which is not 100% of the facts. We have to remember that Maduro is recognized as the legitimate president of Venezuela by the United Nations, and more than almost 150 countries agree with that. So it's not true to say that Guaidó is the legitimate president of Venezuela. That's a political view that you need to respect or not, but it's a political view. So the judge allowed that view to be shared with the jury, but she didn't allow the defense to share the view of the defenders. And the defenders were very clear. We always believed that we were acting legally, because the legitimate president of Venezuela asked us to collaborate and protect the embassy. And that was exactly what the jury, in the deadlock, they agreed with that vision.
What were the charges that they were charged on?
The charges were basically that they were interfering with the functions of the Department of State agents. So basically that the agents were asking them to leave the building, and they interfere with those functions. But the defense, I think, did a very great job showing that these four defenders, they didn't do anything even close to that vision. They didn't interfere. They didn't actually resist arrest. They were just there, protecting the embassy. And the ambiguity of the situation was extremely clear, because the agents, Secret Service police, the local DC police agents, the Department of State agents, federal agents, all of them, they never arrested them for almost a month. So why? Because the situation of the embassy was not clear, legally was not clear. We have to remember that we have this situation where, according to the US federal law, the president, the executive power, can impose an ambassador. Any person can become ambassador of France, of Russia, or Argentina, if the government of the United States says so, which is incredible. And they can say, okay, you are the new ambassador, this is your building, access the building. The Vienna Convention is very clear, you cannot do that. You need to protect, you have the obligation as the host country to protect that embassy. And nobody but the legitimate government could use that building. So that's at the heart of this case here.
And a little bit of context for an audience that not necessarily are absolutely familiarized with the case. The relations between Venezuela and the US got broken. They decided they have no more diplomatic relations. And suddenly the people of Juan Guaidó break a padlock in the consulate of Venezuela in New York, got in without any permission. Then they come here to Washington, and they did the same thing with a military mission. And definitely the next step was going to be jumping to the embassy of Venezuela. At that point, the government of Venezuela gave them the key to these protectors in order to avoid the invasion of the people of Guaidó. And another thing, while they were inside, they were pushing to resolve the matter, as you said, of the Vienna Convention, because the government of Venezuela was accepting that the embassy of the US in Caracas would be managed by a third country, Switzerland. And they proposed the same thing for the embassy here, that could be Turkey, and the US government didn't accept. So the protectors were pushing from the inside, and they say, we will be leaving at the moment that diplomatic issue will be resolved. So they were not there for forever and with any other agenda that to make the international law be there.
Exactly. And imagine that the Venezuelan government or the Argentinian government or the Russian government said, okay, the U.S. embassy building doesn't belong to the U.S. anymore. It belongs to this government, which is represented by X, Y, or Z people. I mean, it's incredible. That doesn't happen in any country. That's why we have the Vienna Convention, to avoid that. So that's why it's very polemic, and the situation in general, and this case represents a very good precedent for the future. Hopefully, in the future, the U.S. is going to respect the Vienna Convention, specifically about immunities and the buildings of the embassies. And so that's why this case, what happened last Friday, was extremely important for international law.
How is the moral of the four protectors?
Very high. I had the chance to talk to the defense, and
the four of them are Americans.
Yes, they are Americans. We have an academic, we have a pediatrician, we have a retired nurse, and we have a lawyer. These are people who are part of the community with very strong values. That's why the government of Venezuela actually trusted them to take care of the embassy while these negotiations were taking place. So they are just waiting for the new date for the trial, which is February 28th, where the government needs to decide if they want to continue with a new trial or they're going to drop the charges. So that's pending.
And if they were be found guilty, what could be the penalty?
The penalty could be at least a year in jail, and almost $100,000 fine each one for each person. but they have announced that if that happens in a new trial, they are going to appeal, and even they're going to go before the Supreme Court. They are prepared to do like a very long fight for
And
this.
also they want to build them for the police, quote-unquote, services around the embassy. These days also build the 4 protectors. They want to charge them.
Sure, sure, but there are a lot of things about that, because we have to remember that the people who don't agree with Maduro, where they are in this attack to the building, I mean, for a month, they damaged the building, not the protectors inside. It was the opposite. They took care of the building. So that's why after the fact, you didn't see any news about damage. It was the opposite. They took care of the building intensely, but the building was in fact damaged by the protesters outside. And they exercised a lot of violence, and the police didn't make any arrest.
The police were complicit?
Well, I'm not sure complicit in that sense, but at least they didn't help to protect the building. In theory, that was the function of all those agents, to protect the building, but the building was still damaged in front of them. So there is a lack of understanding of what was going on there. Who were the attackers? Who were the protectors? Right?
What your gut feeling tells you? What is going to be the decision on February 28th? New trial, or they're going to drop it?
That's a good question. The judge will be the same judge. In theory, it's going to be a new jury, of course. That's a big question. It depends on what the government is willing to do, because this first case or this first round, you didn't really get like a lot of news coverage. So we will see what happens. Maybe if the government tries again, maybe the news outlets are going to take notice of what's going on, and if the results are exactly the same, because the facts will be exactly the same, then it's going to be very bad press for the government if a mistrial again happened, or the charges are actually dropped, or they are not, or they are found innocent. So I would say, I don't know. If I were the government, I will drop the charges right now, because it's very clear that the case is very ambiguous, that the legality of the charges are very weak, that the jury couldn't get convinced about the case that the prosecutors were trying to build against the defenders. So the case is very weak. And the defenders were there believing 100%, and the facts are very clear that they were acting based on international law and based on the authorization of the Venezuelan government. So any jury, I would say, will at least find the case very, very